So to give you some idea of how to do this thoroughly and correctly, what we're going to do is remove sections of this and remove the pump from the housing of the entire body itself. So primarily what we'll do is we'll make sure that there's no thinners in the suction hose, which goes into the material itself. So we've removed that. You'll have some runoff here, so it will pay to put a piece of rag or a container underneath the machine to catch that escaping solvent. So what we'll do is, as I mentioned yesterday, we have a knockdown section. So from here down to here is a knockdown. So we can use a hammer or you can use a pair of Stilsons. So on site, you'll find predominantly you just have a hammer. So we'll undo this and remove this suction hose. So you can remove the suction hose out of your way, which exposes the foot valve of the pump itself. The retainers here are 3 stem bolts with nylock nuts on them, and you have a linch pin in the top, a cover, and the collets underneath that. So ultimately what we're going to do is we'll put a support timber underneath the pump itself so that we can support it. So by putting a support under there, that'll hold the pump in position for me. Now, I know there's no pressure on the pump because I can operate the dump valve. There's no pressure. Pull the trigger on the gun, no pressure, so it's safe to do so. So just to run through that again, before I do anything with this pump, I make sure there's no pressure in this chamber. So to ensure that there's no pressure in the chamber, open the dump valve, pull the trigger on the gun, no pressure. So now that I have no pressure in there, it's safe to dismantle the pump. So the first thing we need to do is take the hose off the pump itself. So by removing this nut here, now if there was pressure on that, that would be very, very tight to undo. So if the pump was pressurised, you wouldn't get that undone. So you can see there's some remnants of solvent there. Just ensure I catch that as best I can and remove the whip check that we had on the hose previously. So now we've done that, we don't drop that in the dirt. Best to put another blank fitting in there or put this up so that it can't be exposed to dirt and contaminants. So with this weeping off beautifully, what we can do is undo these retaining bolts, which are, as I said, nylock nuts. So you'll find that because they've been done up for some time, they'll have paint accumulation around the threads. You need to crack them. So remove these 3 bolts, stem bolts. What I'll do is I'll undo them with a ratchet spanner. So there's 3 of them. So you'll loosen them off like so. Now before I go any further, what I need to do is divorce from the fluid pump from the air motor. So that's joined with a clip. There's just a push-on clip like so. Slide that clip wire up the top of the piston, out of the way. Now the bell is holding the 2 collets. So I slide the bell up out of the way and open the collets. So if I undid all of these bolts, these series of bolts, it'd put too much pressure on the collets and I'd have trouble getting them undone. So by doing it this way, it's before it's got any pressure on there. So there's the 2 collets held with a piece of wire. So remember when you put them back together that if you put the wire to the top, the bell won't come over the top of them. So the wire is just to keep the 2 collets together and the wire goes at the base of the collets. So now we've done that, we'll put the collets to one side so they don't get damaged. Now we've divorced the fluid pump from the air motor. We can now proceed to undo the bolts. So remember what I said, there'll be paint on these. If there is paint on these threads, you'll need to endeavour to clean the threads as best you can instead of winding the bolt over the paint. So now as I bring the fluid pump down, I need to put a support underneath just to hold that pump in place for me. So prior to dropping these 3 bolts, what I'll do is I need to put a support underneath the pump because I'm here on my own doing the job. So the best way to do is a timber support underneath. So this timber support does 2 jobs. One is supports it as the pump comes out, but also 2, when I put the pump leg back in, because it's quite heavy and you don't strain yourself and you don't pinch your fingers in these stem bolts, you're best to put a support underneath there and lift it back up into place. So we're using this to lift it down, we're using this to assist in its reinstall position. So continue to laboriously undo these bolts. Now that I've supported, it doesn't matter if I do one at a time, but just remember, when you reinstall it, you have to do these bolts up in series. You can't just do one bolt up because the pump will kick to one side and pinch on the stem. So continue to undo your bolts. The pump can't go anywhere and fall on me because it's supported by this piece of timber. And because they're nylock nuts, what you're looking for in the nylock nut is the nylon on the outside of the nut. If you find that the nylon has diminished to the stage where it's no longer obvious on the crimped section of the face of the nut, you need to replace the nuts as well. Primarily because the nylock nut is designed to screw up once and the nylon holds the nut in place to stop it coming undone. They utilise these instead of spring washers or star washers. So you can see the pump is starting to come down into position. So just remember in sequence, when you remove items from the pump, make sure you put them back in sequence as well. So remember, we've done the 3 nuts, the collets, and now this will be ready to come out. One thing you might find, the legs on these vary. Also, it's indicative to the area you might be doing this job. It could be uneven ground and so forth. So for this particular installation, we put 2 blocks underneath the front of the pump to help assist the removal of the pump body with this piece of timber that I put in. So what I can do now is just put my leg on this to hold this, lift the support up, pull that out, and then basically the whole pump is sitting with a very little thread holding that in place. So now what I can do is I can put my hand on the pump and ensure that any pin retainers that are there are removed off these stem bolts. Normally the one you'll have is a pin retainer wire that holds the pin for this particular barrel, which I'll show you later on. So now I've got the pump sitting there ready to come out. I can tip that forward, tip it back, roll the pump forward, and there you have it. So ensure that all the escaping fluids go into a container and don't hurt the environment. So this one here, that is the collet retainer. The collet retainer, remember, held the collets in place, which is a bell. So to save you a lot of grief by putting all this back in there and then say, oh, I forgot that, what I normally do is, with this pin or clip, I'll slide this back up here and just put that pin on there. So this bell or collet retainer that I spoke about earlier, it pays to put it back on the shaft. That's the air motor shaft. Put it back on the shaft and slide the circlip or pin back in on the dolly so it stays there for you. Because what can happen is you can put the pump back into its position and then realise that you've forgotten to put the bell on the shaft, so you have to take the whole thing back off again. So there's a trap for young players.